I'm speaking with Clare Walsh, co-chair of the Development Working Group for Australia's G20 presidency in 2014. Hi Clare, how are you?
I'm very well.
Why does the G20 have a development agenda, and when was it started?
The G20, I would argue, has always had a development agenda. Half of the membership of the G20 are developing countries, and half of the world's poor live in countries that are members of the G20. So in effect, when the G20 talks about its objective of achieving strong, balanced, sustained economic growth, it's talking about that in developing countries. But really it wasn't until the crisis of 2007 to 9, where you saw crisis happening in food, in fuel and in finance, that the real interconnectedness between countries came to the fore. And there was a real sense that not only do the crises affect countries in a way that doesn't sit neatly around a G20 table, but also the response requires efforts right across the globe, and again, not just by G20 economies. So in 2010, as part of the Korean presidency in Seoul, a dedicated development working group was established to look at the issues of development with a particular focus on those countries that aren't members of the G20, and amongst those, the low-income countries. And so since Seoul, since 2010, there's been a dedicated working group, and we've been working very closely to ensure that you do see the G20 taking a more considered view of development issues in the context of its own mandate.
What does your role involve?
So I co-chair the Development Working Group. The way these things work is you have a troika, which generally is made up of the outgoing presidency, the current presidency and the incoming presidency. In our case, we have 4 co-chairs because it recognises that we do need to think about developing countries as our audience, and so South Africa is also almost a permanent co-chair. So my role is to co-chair at the moment with South Africa, Turkey as the incoming presidency, and Russia as the outgoing presidency. It's a pretty big agenda that we have. We have 5 areas that we focus on: infrastructure, domestic resource mobilisation, financial inclusion, food security and human resource development. And my role is really to take those agendas forward, but also we have to, if we're seriously looking at developing countries and their needs and their aspirations, obviously we need to be talking to developing countries. So a big part of my role is an outreach both to developing countries but also their regional organisation and bodies, because many of them, if you think about the Pacific and Africa in particular, a lot of their work is done through regional organisations. But we're also consulting very widely with international organisations, the World Banks, the UN organisations, the OECD and others, who have a particular role themselves in economic growth issues for developing countries, making sure we're linked up, and then also working with non-government organisations, think tanks, other parts of civil society who have got lots of things to contribute to our agenda.
What is the G20's development agenda achieving?
The G20's development agenda has those 5 areas that I outlined previously. In the Australian presidency, we've been focusing on 3 of those: infrastructure, financial inclusion and domestic resource mobilisation. In infrastructure, what we've been looking at is the conditions that are required to attract more financing into infrastructure, which, as you'll be aware, is a big need for most countries, but a particularly large need for developing countries and low-income countries. And the focus of our work has been on project preparation facilities. For many developing countries, the projects are not being prepared in such a way as that can attract finance, whether that's domestic or international finance. In the area of domestic resource mobilisation, we've really been trying to align our agenda with that of the finance ministers. So that's around base erosion and profit shifting, and also around moving towards a global automatic exchange of information standard. Recognising, though, that these can be quite difficult for countries with quite sophisticated tax bases, we're also looking at the issues around capacity building for countries who have perhaps tax systems that aren't as developed as you might like to be ready to participate in the opportunities that both BEPS and AEOI provide. In the area of financial inclusion, it still shocks me to have a look at the statistics around the amount of people in the world today who don't have access to the very basic services you and I take for granted: can't get a bank account, can't get access to insurance, can't get access to credit, lines of credit. And it's very difficult for most of us to understand how you would build your own wealth and contribute to your community's wealth if you don't have access to those basic services. So that's a big area we've been working on, to try and increase access to financial services for the poor and for people in developing countries. Part of their work on financial inclusion has also been around remittances. The flow of money through labour, people who work in one country and remit their wages back to their home countries, is quite surprising. It's very high, but there can be high costs associated with that flow as well. So you may go to the bank and say, I'd like to take $100 and send it home to my family, and lose $20 in the transaction. So it's how do you bring down those costs so that that money is actually going into the pockets of those that need it most. So I've been doing some work on that. But we haven't been ignoring the other two pillars, if you like. On food security, what we've done is gone back to basics and said, what is it that the G20 can best do in the area of food security and nutrition, and also thinking about that in the context of how you build jobs and how you grow economies. So going back, doing the evidence and building a framework that says when the G20 engages on food security and nutrition going forward, it's within these parameters. This is where we can best add value. And then continuing the ongoing work on human resource development around skills in particular.
How has the G20 development agenda progressed under Australia's presidency in 2014? So
the G20 development agenda is a multi-year one. Presidency, it doesn't lend itself to an annual cycle, if you like. So as I said, we prioritise those three areas ourselves. Other presidencies will take up other issues. Having said that, what we have tried to do in the Australian presidency is make the agenda more coherent across the G20. So by that I mean that the infrastructure work that is happening in the finance track and the work that we're doing in the development working group is really coherent. There's a sensible way of thinking about infrastructure across the whole of the G20. So made some big improvements there. Similarly around taxation, as I was saying earlier, really aligning the work that we're doing on taxation and domestic resource mobilisation with that of finance ministers, but also looking at other areas like the anti-corruption working group and the employment task force, because there's lots of synergies between our work and the work of those organisations. We've made some good progress on the commitments that we made last year under the St Petersburg Development Outlook, and there's some concrete actions that we've committed to going forward.
Thank you for your time, Clare.
It's a pleasure, thank you.